G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far you are also having a brilliant week. I know it is a shorter week for a lot of people because we had a public holiday yesterday and then another one on Friday for Anzac Day. So enjoy the 3-day week if you have it. Now legends, of course, as always, we have a lot to go over. You can basically say it verbatim by now. Of course, we will look at the maps. We're going to compare maps and look at a little bit of footage as well. We need to talk about a very important aircraft that has now entered the battlefield. We've actually been waiting for this for a very, very long time. Long enough ago that we had a red background behind us. We may have seen a new UAV enter the battlefield as well. At least it's been talked that maybe the Grand 3 was striking Odessa last night. So we'll talk about that and that expected influx of drones too. We need to talk about negotiations, ceasefires, Putin, Trump, Zelensky, what's going on there, and just clear up a couple of things because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about this and there's still people trying to defend the point that Trump willing to walk away is having an impact on Putin. It is having an impact, but it's positive. Putin is not scared of Trump walking away. That is the best thing that can happen for Russia in this war is the US go, we are out. And when Trump has a warning of we will walk away, that is aimed at Zelensky. But we'll talk about that. We'll talk about some things that Putin has said as well as Crimea. And then we need to talk about some demographics and maybe some delusion and industrial output as well. As a Ukrainian ambassador has spoken about continuing the war basically through to 2029, reliance on Germany and how Germany can give 30+% of total military items to Ukraine. And we're going to break that down because the point missed in all of that is manpower. And I do not give a shit how good a tank is, how good an aircraft is, how good anything is, because unless someone is sitting in the tank, sitting in the aircraft, or sitting at the front line, the war can't move forwards. We're not at that point of robotics yet to take humans off the battlefield. I wish that we were, but we need to then talk about how demographics impact this from then, I can't remember what his actual title is, but he's basically like a professor of demographics, and have a look at Ukraine and have a look at where these numbers are getting skewed because the numbers are going off the best possible scenario, being Ukraine retakes Crimea and all of the occupied territories. It's not taking into account the, say, 4 to 6 million people that may get stuck in that band. Okay, so let's start on this aircraft, then we'll do the maps, and then we'll go through the rest. So we have seen this. Now, this plane here has been seen on the map around Lviv as welcome. Now, what this is, at least what it's reporting, is the long-awaited Saab 340, the AEW and C, of course, the Airborne Early Warning and Control. It's a Swedish aircraft. We do believe that 2 of these are getting donated to Ukraine. This is basically an AWACS. What it can do is it will talk and coordinate with other elements, most likely being the F-16s. Now, all figures around anything like this are very classified, but figures do suggest that the detection range for a fighter-sized target is around 300 to 350 kilometers, given a usual fighter radar cross-section. The instrument range can be more like 400 to 450, but for that size, we're talking that. But of course, if we start reducing that radar cross-section, either by a reduced size of the elements, so down to, say, a drone, or something like a Su-57 with a reduced radar cross-section. Now, realistically, the radar cross-section of those aircraft, we don't actually know. People will love to spout on about it, but we don't know what it actually is. But it's going to be less than, say, a Su-27, that it will have a reduction in that. But in my opinion, this is Ukraine's most important aircraft. We spoke about this then well over a year ago about this is very, very important and will make those F-16s far more lethal. But this also makes it the highest priority to target. And there's going to be very few people actually trained on if one of these does go down or if it was destroyed on the ground. I think because of this, of how much of a high priority Russia will put on this and how important it is, it will most likely be used like most of the F-16s are used in an air defense role, because Ukraine, they cannot afford to lose this. Now, its operating range, let's talk at 300 to 400 kilometers, let's say that will be inside range of S-400. Now, this, of course, isn't including standoff range, because the S-400 is not directly on the border. This is not going to be directly on the border. So, of course, there is overlap, but there's also going to be areas that are not overlapping. But the reason I bring this up is it's still definitely a target that could be taken down. And as well, these have a massive signature. The massive radar on top, well, that is emitting huge amounts of power, and anti-radiation missiles can target that more easily given the huge amount of power. Now, Russia's R-37M, an updated variant of the air-to-air missile, they have a claimed range of about 400 kilometers, and these were specifically designed to hit HVTs like AWACS or tankers or bombers from standoff. So I don't know when or if we'll really see this operating on the front line. Realistically, we see the F-16s operate around Sumy, but not in other areas. But we may see the effectiveness of targeting some of those like drones like Iran's then improve. The problem with things like Iran is just the sheer amount of them. You can only carry so many weapons on the rails or so many then bullets in your systems on the ground. And this is what we have seen overnight. We have seen Odessa get hit very, very hard with drones. And a lot of the footage too, there seems to be very little or no anti-air fire as well. So it's not yet 100% clear which variant of this drone was used, and potentially it can be a mixture of many different variants too. But there does appear to be some consensus there was turbojet Garand 3s being used, so over the propeller one to more of a then turbojet propulsion, like a jet engine, okay? Now, what we do know is Russia is increasing production of these relatively inexpensive and simple systems. They know their attrition rate is very high, so just produce massive amounts. And I went over this the other day, that if you're saying, yep, we intercept 95%, and say you just say, yeah, 95% of our weapons are intercepted, then what you plan to do then is not build 100, you plan to build 1,000, because even if it's the same percentage, that means a significant more are still getting through. So this is some of the footage that we hear on this video, and I want you to listen to this, and I know it will sound like a Junkers from back in the Second World War, but notice the sound then cuts off once we see it impact. It's definitely not definitive proof that this newer weapon system has been used, but there's a lot of consensus that it was something different. And this is basically what we're looking at, the classic Garand Shahed in the background here with more of the propeller engine, and this one with a turbo jet. Also reduced signature being black, and there's also some talks of smoothing off edges to reduce that RCS too. And we see this that was reported from ISW back in, it was early March, but it's talking about a GUR, so Ukraine's military intelligence, on Feb 18th, that they're modernising and increasing the production of these and producing the Garand 3 variant. It's got a different type of warhead, a larger warhead, and improvements to the navigation and power systems from nose to tail. We do know that navigation system in the original Garand Shahed has been improved very recently with the Cometa antennas, and that is being put into also then the FABs as well. The GUR reported that the Garand 3 drone is an analogue of the Shahed 238 and can fly at a speed of up to 500 to 600 kilometers per hour and has a range of 2,500 kilometers. So a very long way and very, very fast also. And one of the things I think Russia does with a lot of these is, one, of course, targeting areas, but two, just because they are cheap, but air defense is very expensive and, of course, limited, is to wear out some of that before we see more ballistic missiles in the air. So let's have a look at the maps before we look over some more politics, diplomacy, boring stuff, but very, very important. So Here is Ukraine in the centre of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. The red check on this map, of course, is areas where Russia has occupied over the past 24 hours, and the blue check vice versa of Ukraine then taking back territory. So let's come up into Kursk. Now, remember, Suryk claimed that this was back to the border. We don't know on that yet. What we do know is Guaevo, there was pushes by the Russian forces into these areas, as well as flags gone up around here. But Suryk is suggesting that during that Easter reduction in hostilities, I wouldn't call it a truce or a ceasefire, but we'll call it a reduction in hostilities, that Russia did pull out of here and Ukraine was able to take back some ground. So during the truce, the Russian army retreated from the St. Nicholas Monastery, southeast of Gornal. Ukraine army recaptured the monastery as well as lost positions during the last 4 days. Hours later, the monastery was completely destroyed by Russian forces, and these were, I believe, FABs dropped on that area. So if we come in, the area we're talking about is just in where my cursor is at the moment. So we have at least footage that showed Russian forces there, and now Russian forces targeting that specific area also. So let's move our way all right the way down, because we don't have much until we get into the Pokrovsk sector, Toretsk. But let's talk Pokrovsk first, because around Udashny here, we do see a reduction in Russian control. Now, why am I not calling this a Ukrainian gain? Because I think that this should be in blue check if it is a gain rather than a reduction in control, therefore increasing the grey area. Okay, so we do see that there was an advancement or reduction in here. We're not particularly sure, but we can see that on the maps. Suryk has a few corrections in here. So south of here, we have what I call the Zaporizhia, or you could call it the Troitsky front line. And Suryk has then clarified what has occurred in here. During the last 2 days, Ukraine army was able to drive the Russian army out of the eastern outskirts of Troitsky, so out of this sector here. During the truce, the Ukrainian forces regained control over Botanivka and after a Russian withdrawal. In addition, minor corrections were made south of Kotlarivka. So in around this area, we can see a Russian gain in here, but it's also a withdrawal / pushback in and around this sector. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was opportunities taken by both Russia and Ukraine to improve their positions during that reduced tempo. And that can mean withdrawing to a more advantageous positions if you are in an area that is getting hit too heavily or getting cut off. Remember, we're in a war of attrition. It's about saving forces first, making ground in other areas second, because you want to influence political outcomes with military objectives. Okay, so then we come into the Pokrovsk East Sukha-Balka area, and Suryk maps in here saying that Russian army took full control over Sukha-Balka. And I've seen a lot of other mappers today suggesting that Sukha-Balka has come under Russian occupation. But wait out on that before we confirm anything. Then we'll come into Toretsk. No changes shown today. We open this up, and we have during the last 2 days, Russian army entered the first parts of Dashny. So we have Dashny in here. This is this red dot. That there has been movement then up this tree line across to then the west between Davlivkia and Dashny, and is entering some areas in here. Again, wait out on this. I just want to see if there's been any grey zone shift. Yes, there has been some grey zone shift here. So we know there was definitely some level of movements here. How far? Well, we can't figure it out off that. Now, before we then move further north, we'll come right down into the south, right around then the Kamyansky-Lobkove front line. Remember, this map in here, I believe, is best part, if not more, of 6 months actually behind on some areas. But regardless, we can look at this and get an idea. Well, there was definitely some movements here. Suryk maps, bang, same position. So we can then confirm there was definitely advancement in this direction. Of course, Suryk is showing it's far more north than this map, or relatively more north. And I wouldn't say far, it depends what you say. But during the last hours, Russian army entered the 1st Brigade residential area, the southeastern part of Kamyansky. So just keep an eye on here, but we can confirm there was definitely some level of movement. Now, let's come back up into Terny, the area I spoke on at length yesterday. Now, no changes shown on here. We can see this entry into Novay over the past week. We have 2 Suryk maps updates. So this road, which is heading across here on this dog leg, this is this one right here. During the truce, Ukraine army managed to recapture the eastern outskirts of Rydkabadub. Can't pronounce that, but this eastern outskirts right on this road, so up to this area. So still showing further then the deep state map is in here. As well, to the south of here, towards then Zarachne, that Suryak has confirmed what is occurring here as well. So if we line up where these reservoirs are sitting, he's talking this area just in here. That Torsky remains under full control of the Ukrainian army. During the first weekend of April, Russian army managed to infiltrate the northern part of the locality, but was unable to establish itself due to the higher presence of drones and Ukrainian counterattacks. Russian forces are currently securing the Bakay ravine from which to access the last heights to the northeast. So they're pushing down in this direction in here, but this sector of Torsky, Zarachne remains under Ukrainian control. Let's see if there's been a change in grey zone in here. No, sorry, it just didn't look that normal to myself, but that will end our mapping. So there are some movements, some changes, and further confirmations. Let's talk about ceasefire and negotiations, and where there's just so much, I guess, incorrect when you think about it critically on this. And if you ask me, the biggest thing facing domestic problems in every country, I guess, or at least what I see, is just the ability to think critically about this. So a Ukrainian delegation is due in London on Wednesday for talks with Britain, France, and the US to discuss ways to end the war post then the discussion between the European states and the US. Zelensky said, we have a primary task to push for an unconditional ceasefire, and this must be a starting point. So we know that meeting is going to take place, but we know where the US is sitting and where then Britain and France are as well. It's very far apart. Now, there's leaks that suggesting that the Trump administration is now pushing for a peace deal that heavily favours Russia. Shock, horror, a deal to end the war favours the winning party. Like, I don't see how, I can see why you may disagree with this, but I can't see how, if you think critically, you go, well, of course it's going to be that way. If Ukraine was currently advancing in every sector on the front line and all the indicators of attritional war were in their favour, you would say, well, look, this is going to be in the favour, or heavily favour, Ukraine. That's why Ukraine wants to be in a position of power, is so that it favours them. Okay, it would include a pause of the conflict along the 1,000-kilometre front line, recognition that Crimea belongs to Moscow, and a veto on Ukraine's NATO membership. So that's what apparently the US is suggesting. And what I've said is, I don't think Putin's going to go for that. I think that he still wants his more maximalist demands of Crimea and the 4 oblasts, some of which he doesn't occupy completely, as well as Ukraine outside of NATO. Reports that the ZNPP will remain in a neutral zone. So again, we don't really know, but if it's a shock to you that if you just go X and Y and you say X country is having more success on the battlefield, Y is not, if there was negotiations, which way is it going to tilt? You're going to go, well, it's going to go X, okay? You're not going to be determining and dictating the outcomes from a position of weakness, okay? That's exactly what Ukraine wants to do, the opposite of that. And if you suggest that if Russia was in the position of weakness on the front line and you suggested that they should be dictating the terms, everyone would call you an idiot. Now, speaking of Crimea, there's been a little bit more clarification on this from the advisor to the head of the presidential office, Serhiy Leshchenko, and that Zelensky has responded that the US may recognise Crimea as Russian and that this won't be happening. He said all negotiators attending meetings either in Saudi or in France clearly say that the issue of Ukraine's territorial integrity is not being discussed at all. So saying no one here is talking about that. And even the Constitution of Ukraine contains many prohibitions and restrictions, and the media landscape is filled with it. But saying that we're not discussing that, that is our thing to discuss, not yours. And he states that similar rumours circulated 10 years ago, post-2014. Now, firstly, I do believe that territory is 100% being discussed, because if it's not, and you're dealing with a transactional leader like Trump acting as a negotiator or mediator here, what then are you bringing to the table to transact? So I'd say it's definitely being discussed. The problem is I don't see how Ukraine can ever actually agree to this. This is where it is in Putin's favour strategically to continue the war, because they know Zelensky's never going to actually sign off on that. Well, we don't think so. And if not, then how does Ukraine plan to return this? Because America will be sitting going, okay, then if you're not willing to make some deal here, present to us how are you going to actually then return this militarily, because at the moment, diplomatically, given the time frame, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So what is the actual plan in here? And I would say, look, I know I'm going against officials here, but I would say it's 100% being talked about. Now, Putin has said for the first time in years that he is open to bilateral talks with Ukraine. And of course, they're previously demanding that Zelensky must be replaced, that elections must happen before then he will open up discussion for Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine said the exact same basically about Putin. Now, on Russian state TV, Putin has said, we've always talked about this, that we have a positive attitude toward any peace initiatives. We hope the representatives of the Kyiv regime will feel the same way. So in this, you need to be able to draw a line between this in here, as well as Putin and Zelensky face pressure from the Trump administration in the US, which has threatened to walk away from its peace efforts. You have to show that these are not mutually exclusive. These are linked. Now, Putin and Zelensky, they are both conducting political actions to appeal to the US. Now, firstly, what I'll say is Zelensky's unconditional ceasefire, which he brings up at every time that he can. He knows that Russia will not agree to this, given the situation where Russia's leverage is militarily, that it's just taking away any leverage that Russia may have in further negotiations. He knows, everyone knows, that Russia is not going to agree to that. But by calling it an unconditional ceasefire, it paints it that Russia is the one being unreasonable, therefore scoring US brownie points. Now, Putin, on the other hand, he's scoring some points too. By Putin saying that he is open for talks, but talks in a nature that he knows Zelensky can't and also illegally can't participate in, he's winning some brownie points. But what I will push back on this article and say is, look, there is in no way, shape or form the first time that the Kremlin has said that they are open for talks to end the war. Now, this Putin and Zelensky face pressure? No. Zelensky faces pressure, not Russia. Russia want the US to walk away. Those suggesting that by walking away, that's, or threatening that's pressure on Russia, it's positive for Russia. Russia want nothing more. Putin wants nothing more than the US to walk away. And this gentleman here, this Mr. Andriy Melnik, who's the Ukrainian ambassador to Berlin and a Ukrainian representative to the UN, has coined this open letter called The Future of Ukraine Now Also Depends on Friedrich Merz, of course, the new chancellor coming into Germany. Now, an open letter to Germany's designated chancellor. I'm writing to you not as a diplomat, but as a human being and a European. And he talks about the people want peace, and we make enormous sacrifices every day, and politicians are desperately searching for solutions to end this madness, but they can't find any. So he's giving what he sees as the way to peace in this. Okay, so he talks about what is happening here. It's not only the future for the Federal Republic depends on your success as Chancellor, but also the fate of Ukraine and all of Europe. So by your success, this is going to determine the fate of all of Europe, Ukraine, and Germany. Saying that with this, it's in your hands as a peacemaker to stop this damned war by 2025. But how? How can a breakthrough be achieved? The situation seems deadlocked. I wouldn't say it's deadlocked with the advances we see, but that it's almost hopeless. Here are 5 steps you could take in the first 100 days of your chancellorship to cut the Gordian knot and force Putin to make peace. Now, these that he gives is not going to end the war in 2025 because a lot of this takes a long time. I think people have this illusion that you can just give a weapon system and like, okay, that weapon system's in play. You might even have to build factories. Now, first, adopt a coalition resolution on financing arms deliveries to Ukraine amounting to at least 0.5% of GDP. So 0.5% of your country's GDP per year to finance Ukraine. He says it'd be $21.5 billion per year or $86 billion by 2029. So that is a huge amount of money. To take the wind out of your critics' sails, one could consider a loan agreement. One of the problems with a lot of these loans is we know they a lot of the time never get paid off. They get forgiven, but also the Chancellor and others need to look at what is the realistic ability for Ukraine to pay off a loan this large, even if the war were to end. Okay? Second, initiate and implement the same 0.5% regulation at the EU level, so 372 billion euros by 29, as well as within the G7, an additional 181 billion. So EU, G7, everyone is giving 0.5 of their GDP to Ukraine, not counting the US yet. Now, Europe, they need to accept that if they want to fight on and they want to continue the war, America's not in. America is out, and if they want to go, they're going at it alone. This mega commitment of $500 billion or over $500 billion euros for Ukrainian defence over the next 4 years will be a massive warning signal to Putin that you, Mr. Mers, and our allies are serious about aiding Ukraine. So saying that in the first 100 days, if you just announce this, it'll be such a warning to Putin that he will withdraw. But you also need to say, well, if he doesn't, this is my forbidden question. What if Putin doesn't? If he doesn't, you need to be prepared to go through with it too and fight on. And what I will say is you can have all the money in the world, but with this, you're still going to need factories to actually have the output of this. And you're also relying on, in democratic countries such as Germany and the EU, you are relying on the appetite of continuation too. In Germany, we saw this huge increase in the right-wing AfD party. So a huge increase in people who, one, they want domestic policy, but also they're saying, well, we don't want this international relations policy as well. So the thing is, if you suggest 0.5% of your total GDP, it might look good on paper, but in any next elections, and specifically EU with the veto powers of other countries, they're going to go, well, okay, we're voting in this and kicking out that. The appetite for continuation of this war, I believe, is decreasing every day, decreasing everywhere also. So that needs to be taken into account. Third, announce the immediate delivery of 150 Taurus cruise missiles. Now, the Taurus will be effective. The actual numbers of these, if this was 1,500 or 15,000, would be far more impressive. Realistically, these are just a replacement for Storm Shadow or Scalp. And as we see with any weapon system, and like I talked about those peaks and troughs yesterday, you see a large peak in the beginning and then it really then taper off as far as its effectiveness. And the amount of these in quantity is still questionable. But it would make some difference. But it's not going to be the difference between complete total victory or not. Now, fourth, also to ensure the efficient use of the Taurus systems, coalition decisions should be made to transfer 30% of the available German fighter jets and helicopters from the Air Force's infantry to Ukraine. This would amount to 45 Eurofighters, 30 Tornadoes, 25 NH-90 helicopters, 15 Eurocopter Tigers. Sorry to tell you, but bloody MH-90s, NH-90s and Eurocopters are a piece of shit. This step, if not Australia, wouldn't be turning back to Apaches and Blackhawks. This could be implemented as part of a comprehensive loan from the Bundestag. The main thing is that they delivered quickly. The same 30% rule could be introduced for other weapon systems from the Army Infantry to release the following critical deliveries: 100 Leopard 2s, 115 Pumas, 130 Martas, and continue on with Boxers and whatever other vehicles. The thing is in this is you can't deliver this state-of-the-art equipment quickly. Right now, Germany could go, we're giving you 45 Eurofighters. Who's flying that? Who's looking after it? Who's doing any of this? It takes years. Look at the F-16, and the F-16 is still not patrolling the skies everywhere as well. It's going to take a very, very long time. If you want the Taurus missiles to fire off these aircraft, we won't see the first Taurus fired for years, minimum of years. So, yeah, and we talk about these systems, rocket artillery systems, modernisation then of the German army in order to quickly replace the delivered systems. So 30% across. But the problem is, and what is being missed in all of this, is what about your manpower. We know Ukraine's primary issue is manpower. America was saying the Biden administration, the most pro-Ukraine administration the US has had, you send us men and we'll train them. And there wasn't men to send. At least we know that there are problems around this, and we're going to go into this. But this idea that you can just send equipment and next thing there's Eurofighters flying around the skies, yeah, okay. Anyway, talks about confiscating 200 billion euros from frozen assets to adopt concrete military security guarantees, and not only formally affirm the prospect of NATO accession, but also ensure the alliance, especially in relation to the US. So in this as well, so formally affirm NATO. We know US has said NATO is off the table. 200 billion euros, even the most pro-Ukrainian litigators, parliamentarians, whatever you want to call them, unelected officials as far as Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas, even they are having warning about this. And this goes into my idea that Europe is not doing everything that they could. They're saying they are, but they realistically are not. But there's huge threat for the undercutting of the euro from this as well, with dependence on China. Okay, but let's talk about this manpower, and I'll bring up why it's an issue. Ukraine, at a minimum, to the US, to the Biden administration, to the Trump administration, and to Germany, they need to show their commitment in the form of conscription of 18 to 25-year-olds. We know that Zelensky is not willing to do this due to the future demographics. That is probably the correct decision if the war ends soon. Implementing high-end weapon systems like this takes years and further years for it to actually make a difference. So it took years for the F-16 to even be delivered, and then for it to really be starting to make a difference is going to take a lot more time. These are very, very complex. But focusing on just equipment like that, you need to still focus on just mass and people at the front line. You're also implying that the young Ukrainians who left in 2022 will not return to 2029 if the war then continues. There are already concerns about these people returning home. As I say, Ukraine is first and foremost the people. Secondary is maybe the territory, but it is the people. Now, in relation to these high-end weapon systems, Ukraine needs mass shells, mass bombs, mass air defense, and mass manpower. But there's an annex with mass manpower. It needs to be those who are willing to fight also, not literally nabbed and stolen off the street and chucked into a van. And this is a hurdle that I can't see a fix for unless Ukraine starts winning on the front line and morale and war outlook improves. And I can't see how this willingness, like if someone hasn't signed up 3 and a bit years yet, obviously they don't want to. And they're not going to sign up when it is if they didn't sign up in end of 22, mid 23, when the morale was everywhere in Crimean beach parties and this, why would they be signing up now? Regardless of how much money you throw at someone, that's the problem. The only way I can see this shifting is Ukraine winning, having big wins on the battlefield and people seeing then an outlook improvement and, then I will sign up. The problem is Europe needs to know that if they want to continue, the US is withdrawing support. And what I think the biggest problem of this is that's not spoken about. If the US withdraws support, the outlook and morale will absolutely be in the toilet. It will plummet. What Ukrainian leaders need to be aware of is a real possibility is that in the hope of ideals, that victories become Pyrrhic. That you end up with these ideals of we're doing this, doing that. But if you're not replacing the men at the front line and you're focusing on all this technology and whatever, even if you have areas of success, your demographic issues are going to be exacerbated potentially very, very quickly. And I saw this article today of this demographer, Alexander Gladium, to preserve the population. Ukrainian women need to give birth to 3 children, but these numbers are skewed. This came out on Monday, the 21st. Also talks about labour migrants from Asia and some issues that can happen there. And what I will say is Ukraine is not a fantastic nation, I guess, to put in those Asian migrants compared to what we see as far as Central and maybe Western Europe. And we know there's been a huge problem there, but the immigration in Ukraine is a very, very conservative state and is going to be in a state of some extreme opinions following the savagery of War II that already we know there was a big pushback in Eastern Europe against migration and into Ukraine. Well, we don't know if it's going to be the best example of that. So there is some concern around that too. But we'll go over this. The impact of war on the country's demographics. The question was asked, what is the current demographic situation in Ukraine? The situation is bad, but during a war, it cannot be good. Since the birth rate is decreasing and the death rate is increasing, and the demographics are also affected by huge migration flows, so emigration out of the state. In 1991, there was 42 million people within our borders. At the beginning of 25, there was 34 million. This figure is skewed because this includes Crimea and occupied territories. Now, this figure is skewed because of those occupied territories by around 6 million, or we presume around that number. It also doesn't account for migration flows out of Ukraine as well, or then no one has correct loss figures. So it is at least 6 million less than this, and where there's numbers float around of 10 million have left Ukraine, let's say, 25% don't come back, you're losing another 2.5 million. That's a very, very rosy picture. So a lot of these outcomes are skewed off these figures that say, well, there's going to be complete then reunification of these areas in Crimea as well. So be aware of that. Now, if we talk about the development of our population through fertility, how many children should Ukrainians have to improve the demographics? In order for the population not to decrease due to natural factors, women should be giving birth to this many children. We're talking about Ukrainian women of reproductive age from 15 to 49. Taking into account that some women are not going to have children, that the remaining Ukrainian women need to give birth to about 3 children each so that the population does not decrease. No other country in Europe has such a birth rate. But again, this figure is skewed. This figure is skewed because this is including women that are currently in occupied territories or women that have left Ukraine as well. Now, what I don't know is this figure of 3 children per female in this 15 to 49 years, is this on top of those in that who already have children? And we also need to be realistic about this number, that the reproductive age range, of course, people that can reproduce, that's far wider than in reality what age people actually have children. 15-year-olds, well, it does happen, but, 49-year-olds, well, you're really on the tail ends of this. If you shrunk this to 18 to 35, say, where the bulk of that is going to be sitting, what would the results say then? And then if you reduced, let's say, 6 million occupied territories, 3 million people out of that pool, again, this is things that need to be taken into account in Kyiv and go, if we're continuing the war, this is still going to get worse. What is the actual recovery rate here if the war goes on another year, 2 years, or say 4, 5 years to 2029? This is what needs to be taken into account. Existential survival of the state. In Ukraine, the issue, and this is why I bring this up, the issue of the need to lower the mobilisation age to 18 is periodically raised. Now, it's raised all the time. It's just not popular. How could this affect the country's demographics? Now, there are even fewer people will reproduce in the next generations if more people die. This is from a demographic point of view. And from a political point of view, lowering the mobilisation age is a matter for the military. They should calculate their needs in age categories. And if there is a need for 18 and 25-year-olds, then they should mobilise. Otherwise, there will be no country. And then what demographics can we talk about? And this is what I call Zelensky's manpower paradox. He sums up well here. That if there is a need and we don't mobilise and therefore we lose the country, well, we have no demographics to then discuss. He brings up in this of how to use young people because Zelensky's concern is losing these young people to not reproduce who sit in that bulk age bracket. And what he says is, well, it's not everyone is sent immediately to the front line. Maybe these people can be mobilised and sent for logistical support. As we know, there are 3 to 6 people really behind than a singular troop on the front line. So, of course, in a much more safe position, increases their chances of survivability. Now, therefore, he says this should be a decision for the military because imagine that 20,000 people who were not drafted and because of this, the country was destroyed. Then Russia would seize our territories, impose citizenship and draft our youth to fight. Again, this goes into his then paragraph here on this manpower paradox is what if these people aren't drafted and we lose even more? So this idea that it's existential, the war, but we're not willing to draft down, but also, well, if we don't draft down, it's probably going to be existential as well. This is this area that is stuck in at the moment of this then repeating loop that is, well, there might need to be diplomatic outs looked at. And if you're heading into this saying that there's no talk about any territories, then Putin's first question and Trump's first question is going to be, okay then, well, what's the transaction here? The idea of, well, Putin can just walk out and his troops can just walk out now, that at the end of the day, that is an ideal. That's not in reality. That's not going to happen knowing the price that has been paid for those areas. If you start your basis of your argument there, it's no different to me saying that if you gave me $1 million, then I would be a millionaire. It's nice. It might even be right. I think I should be a millionaire. But it's not where you can base your strategy. My strategy for making a living is not you giving me $1 million. Maybe on the Patreon. Legends, you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.